Hey everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. When I was a kid, I lived in eastern Iowa for a little while. The first few years of elementary school, I suppose. This is a little town called Makokata, Iowa. Crazy name. My dad was a pastor there, and while we were there, a bunch of the families in the church went in together, maybe two or three, and they bought a property and they made a roller skating rink. I'd never been to a roller skating rink before, but it was all the rage immediately in the little snack bar. And it's where I learned that you could mix all the different kinds of soda if they had the self-serve soda machine. So I got some good use out of that. And it was my first ever experience with an arcade. And I remember my dad taking a quarter and being like, I'm going to give you $1 to play a game, but this is a waste of time and money. And this is not something for you to get used to. And he was probably right, because I think I have maybe burned through 1 or 2 hours of time over the course of my life on video games. I mean, it's possible. I don't know. It was fun back then, and it's fun now. Now, I don't remember even what game I played. I think it was Donkey Kong, and I think it ended very, very quickly. But then I looked over at my friends whose parents owned the joint, and I realized that they just kept playing. They had pockets full of quarters. And as I looked more closely, I realized the quarters were painted. Well, come to find out, the parents were like, this is a renewable resource. We don't need to be paying for video games we own. We don't need our kids to be paying for arcade games we own. We're just going to paint these quarters, and these will be our family recyclable quarters. When we empty out the machines later on, these quarters just go back into circulation, and then our kids can play a whole bunch, and all the people who aren't our kids can pay for the arcade games with their actual quarters that then we get to keep. Likewise, in Matthew chapter 17, we get a situation where we have a question about taxation at the temple and about the resources that belong to the king and the relationship of the children of the king to the king. We're talking about like God and stuff there. And Jesus is going to run this same familial mental math equation with his disciples about how the things that the Father owns are passed along, or how that pertains to the kids who are a part of that same exact household. If this is confusing, it will be less so in just a minute. Here we're going to read the passage, Matthew 17:24. Here we go. After Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum, the tax collectors of the 2 drachma tax came to Peter and asked, doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax? Okay, perfectly innocent question. Like we talked about right as we were wrapping up yesterday, these people were probably doing Jesus and Peter a favor. There's like a month-long collection window for all adult males, I think it was males, over 20, to help fund the very expensive temple system down in Jerusalem. So whether you ever made your way down there or not, you were supposed to pay this thing. It looks like it was a little bit optional, but pretty much socially mandatory, but it had no government force behind it because this is a religious tax being collected that Rome, I assume, would have just shrugged at. Maybe they would have lightly backed it up just in the interest of keeping order from time to time, but tax is a bit of a misnomer here compared to how you and I think about it. I don't think these people are necessarily attacking Jesus or Peter. It's like, oh, you got to go down and you got to pay it in person, and that's a big pain in the butt. So it would be better if you just pay it here. Were you guys aware? Was he going to pay the thing? We were packing up. We were kind of want to go home. So you just want to settle up here real quick? And Peter's like, well, yeah, he does. And then it goes on, verse 25. When Peter came into the house, Jesus was the first to speak. What do you think, Simon? He asked. From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes from? Their own sons or from others? From others, Peter answered. Well, then the sons are exempt, Jesus said to him. Then there's some stuff about a miracle with a fish and a coin and everything in there. We're going to get to that later. As this narrative unfolds, there's an interesting little tidbit here that might not be immediately evident, but Jesus is in the house when this conversation is going on. Outside the house, Peter, master of the house, is being, I'm told politely, based on the cultural norms that were present in this day and age, he's being politely approached by these people who have official business or questions about one of Peter's guests, Jesus. They raise this question, and Peter's like, okay, yeah, okay, all right. And then he goes back inside, and before Peter brings anything up, the text has Jesus broaching the subject. I think that's a big deal. I think that's telling. It means that Jesus has some kind of theological point that he wants to make here, something that he wants to communicate, and he's pretty eager to talk about it. So when Peter walks back into the house, the first to speak, according to the text, literally is Jesus, and he comes with a question. What do you think, Simon? And this just does not go where you would figure. And I don't know about you, maybe this passage is cake for you. When we cruised through it the other day and I read it out loud for the first time, or the first time you read through this, maybe you're like, oh, I see exactly what they're driving at. I know why that's in the Bible. This one is not hard. That is not the case for me. I had to pore over this for ages the first time I put any real meaningful thought into it, because I didn't see this going the direction it goes. And I don't think Peter probably did either. And then Jesus is like, all right, here's sort of a big ethereal question. Huh? I mean, they just wondered if you were going to pay the bill or whatever. Yeah, but about that, Jesus goes on. So from whom do you think the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own sons or from others? Well, that's an easier question to answer, I would think, for people who lived in eras before the modern Western liberal democratic republic era in which we live now, the constitutional republic era in which we live now. I mean, now we do things one person, one vote, everybody pays taxes. Some people view taxes as a patriotic duty. Other people view it as a frustrating burden. Some people view it as a political weapon to punish ideologies or people groups they don't like. But very few of us would immediately jump to thinking about it in terms of the relationship between a king and subjects. We theoretically don't have kings anymore, or at least we just don't call them that. The text makes look like it has an obvious expected answer from the original audience. Well, of course kings don't collect taxes from their kids. The kids are going to get the money. The king gathers all this money into the royal treasury that belongs to the king. What are you going to do? Take 20% out of the hide of the prince of the kingdom? Well, that's just taxing your own household. Because remember, a king's household wouldn't be like you or I think of households, where you got parents that live at one place, and then their adult children live in other places, and then their adult children live in other places. The king's household was it's an exaggerated version of everybody else's household. It was a domus. It included a ton of people. It was multi-generational, and resources would have been pooled and controlled by the patriarch. And so in light of that, well, obviously a king would not tax their own kid. They would tax others, and the taxation of others would help to build the collective wealth of the household of the king. So Peter gets it right. Peter gets it right from others, obviously. Jesus affirms that, and he says, right, then the sons are exempt. And at that point, most of the big picture philosophical teaching here is done. And it's not really hard to see what he's driving at. God is the king of everything. The temple is Jesus' Father's house. He owns it. It's his household. Any resources that are held there are resources that belong to the king and to the king's family. Well, what is it that we've been saying all along that Matthew is describing Jesus doing? He's building a new family of faith that transcends ethnic boundaries. And the boundaries of this new family of faith in Jesus are born out of faith. Do people follow him and believe in him, or do they reject him? If you follow him, you are his sons, his daughters, his sister, his mother. Chapter 3 has that language about the axe being at the root of the tree, and it's no longer about your ethnic claim and saying, we have Abraham as our father. It's about something much greater than that. And then Jesus shows up to get baptized right after that exchange. This theme has not been subtle, though for you and me, because it's really effectively almost no point of concern for a modern Gentile audience, a modern Gentile reader of the New Testament. We're not going to have that theme pop at us nearly as obviously as it popped at the original audience. But when we really stop and break it down, we see this is very much there, that Jesus is saying, that Matthew is saying there is a new family of faith. And why is this whole thing about the temple tax in here? Well, at the most basic level, it looks like it's in here to reiterate this theme that if you are in Christ, if you're a follower of Christ, you are a part of the household of God. And so he's challenging the disciples to think about God and his family and his house in a very different context, about your admission to God's family and God's house in a very different context. And this tiny little passage right here that just gets buried and is often overlooked, glossed over, and forgotten really helps us to better understand Jesus' very negative reaction when he gets to the temple and sees the money changers who are swapping out all kinds of different currency for the type of coin that is going to appear in this fish's mouth here in just a minute. His reaction to those money changers at least makes more sense in terms of theological importance and motivation in light of this little passage than it would make if we just took it completely on its own in a vacuum as we get there later on. Effectively, Jesus is saying the temple tax doesn't make any sense. God's effectively painted your 2 drachma coin green so that when you run it through the temple machine, it just comes back around. If you're in Christ, that's your Father's house, and it doesn't make sense to be collecting a temple tax from people who have that kind of ownership. This points towards something that we're going to look at more tomorrow, and that is a challenge not just to this tax, but to the entire notion of what the temple does, and it's a point back to that Matthew 5:17 principle of Jesus being the fulfillment of the whole law and prophets, including the temple system that this tax is a representation of. We just have more to think about here, and we're full on time, so we're going to talk about that more tomorrow. Hey, everybody who has signed up to sponsor a kid in Uganda through Africa Renewal, thank you so much. The Africa Renewal people got back to me today and said one of you sponsored a young person in Uganda named Teddy, who is 18 years old and who lives with a single mom who can barely afford to even keep shelter over her family's heads. And as a result, Teddy started school way late because they couldn't afford it. They weren't even close to being able to afford it. And they've tried to piece it together. School just was not going to happen. It was no longer going to be an option at this point. But now, because of one of you, Teddy is in school and is going to be able to finish all the way out. And according to the people at Africa Renewal, that is not just some generic feel-good story about a thing that happened once. That is a thing that happened because you, whoever you are, and you know who I'm talking to, decided to sign up through africarenewal.org/TMBH and sponsor a kid. So that's just inarguably good and awesome of you. And for those of you who are maybe still thinking about doing something like this, I appreciate you continuing to consider it. And again, you can learn more about it at africarenewal.org/TMBH. All right, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.